Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Bridging the Gap Between Development and Regulatory Teams. My name is Laura Court. I am a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you. I know our presenter, Milton Yarberry, is really looking forward to sharing provenly effective processes, tools, and approaches that bridge the gap between development and regulatory. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Integrated Computer Solutions, Inc., I'm going to touch on a few things real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Milton will answer questions from the live audience. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar and we will get to as many as time permits. As we will also be sharing the full recording and slides of today's webinar with all of our registrants after the presentation ends, so keep an eye out for the email from us sometime later today. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know we put them on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely very similar to a mission of many of you who are tuning in with us today. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultant like today's presenter Milton, as well as through our award-winning quality management software. For those of you who said you were interested in seeing how you can manage development and quality simultaneously with Greenlight Guru's end-to-end MedTech lifecycle excellence platform, someone from our team will be reaching out to you after today's webinar. Don't worry if you haven't connected with us yet, but would like to, simply head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar, and you can schedule a brief intro call with us to better understand how our purpose-built solution can better serve your medical device needs. In doing so, you're going to learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to meet needs like market approval from the FDA, compliance with EU MDR and IVDR, ISO 13485 certification, as well as breezing through audits and pushing beyond baseline compliance to deliver true quality medical devices to patients. Now, on to today's bulk of the presentation, let me give a proper introduction to our presenter today and a distinguished partners of ours at Greenlight Guru, Milton Yarberry. Milton is the Director of Medical Programs for Integrated Computer Solutions, also known as ICS. He is a certified PMP and a Scrum Master with a background in software architecture, medical device product development, and program management. He has 20 years in product development with 10 years in software consulting and 15 years working with Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Milton because I know we're all very excited to hear what you have to say today. So Milton, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. All right. So first, I guess, we should always start with a shameless plug just to sort of get that out of the way. My company, ICS and Boston UX, Boston UX is a wholly owned subsidiary of ICS. ICS basically does full stack software development for medical devices and commercial products. Everything from the user interface right on down to device drivers and operating system. Boston UX is sort of our point of entry for many of our projects. It's a dedicated group that does UX development. They start out with a human factor process, and they can do their development to a 62366 standard, which is the usability IEC standard. Interesting. My screen seems to have frozen. Of course, that has to happen, right? Okay, I think I'm having some technical difficulty. I imagine my screen has either gone blank or is frozen on the web share.
That's the fun of a live presentation, though. If you don't have a couple technical difficulties, I don't think it counts.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm glad we got there. Actually, it's still responsive. Let's try this again.
Still see you. There we go. So I can see that. Yes. ICS slide. Are you not able to change to the next slide?
I am not, and the cursor doesn't seem to move, so I think it's a PowerPoint problem. So let's do this. This is the first time I've had a problem of this nature, though, so this is great. This is interesting.
Let me see here if I can get a copy up as well.
Actually, that would be great.
Let's see, let me get PowerPoint pulled up here. Okay, now the fun is I have to figure out how to share my screen. Like I said, what's the fun without a little bit of technical difficulties?
Exactly.
Let me see here. Okay, let's go ahead and share PowerPoint. Show my screen. There we go. Can you see my screen here?
Awesome. Perfect. Yep.
There we go.
All right. Well, thanks for pulling that one out. Hopefully that's the last of them, at least for this presentation. I think I'm only allowed one per presentation. I'm speaking about ICS. So we do human factors engineering, 62366 standards for usability. And as I mentioned, front end, back end software development. Some other ththings that I didn't mention: 14971 compliant hazard analysis. And we have a software development plan that we use to work with our clients around 62304. Last thing to mention is that we do have a complementary software technology assessment that we offer that it's free, and it gets basically, I forget the amount of time, but it gets sort of a free assessment of software architecture and sort of a code review. All right, with that out of the way, if we go to the next slide. All right, so just a real quick word about my background. It is sort of pertinent here. I started out over 20 years ago on the development side of things. I used to work in complex systems, machine learning, and software architecture. I then moved into engineering management and product management, and then ultimately towards regulatory. So my journey from like the development side of the house to the regulatory side of the house is emblematic of, and informs a good piece of what I'm going to present here today. For reference, I was one of the developers who really didn't get along with the constraints of a regulatory development initially. All right, slide, please. All right, so the agenda here, 5 easy bullets, basically defining the problem. It's all good to sort of get on the same page around what we mean about the gap between these two groups. And then I have a section for complicating factors. These are just things that happen that make the gap worse, exacerbated. And then number 3, bridging. So basically solutions to the gap. And finally, nuances. These are like deeper, subtle topics that are sort of underappreciated. And then sort of a quick summary of, where we started and where we ended up. All right, slide, please. Okay, so first, defining the problem. And so so this is I put together sort of like a cloud diagram of the native characteristics of development and regulatory. Focusing first on the development side, I think these are characteristics that don't necessarily have to be personal characteristics, but this is where you spend a large portion of your time doing work if you work in development, particularly software engineering. Throughout the presentation, I have the term development, but it's really shorthand for software engineering, mechanical engineering, system engineering, usability engineering. It's anybody who's working with technology to provide a result and trying to, at the same time, fulfill the regulatory requirements. Yeah, so the debugging, the ad hoc investigation, and sort of a very pragmatic mindset are the elements that dominate on the development side. And next. On the regulatory side, it's a significantly different story. I wouldn't say it's incompatible, but it definitely has different priorities. There are a few elements that are the same, but in different ratios. So regulatory, it's safety, efficacy, typically rule-oriented, and typically process-focused. And it's also their job to sort of bring the principles to the table around safety and efficacy. Next. All right, so defining the problem. So the native workflow of both development, actually, if you could hit slide next again, please. Oh, one more time. There we go, get everything on there. I think this is a slightly earlier version of the presentation. I found this defect and fixed it on mine, but there you go. So defining the problem. So the native workflow of development and regulatory are very different. Development, typically they might start up here in the upper left-hand corner of this diagram with first prioritizing, figuring out what the hard part is of a problem and going after that first. That's a very typical approach. And what that might involve is like investigation. Maybe there's an example of how, the sample code, they might test that. Typically, whenever you try the example, you find it doesn't work. So you're into a debug cycle. And then you're into this cycle of test, analysis, modify, debug. And you could go around and around all that merry-go-round for quite a while. At the end of this, what's significant is that this could end in either failure or success. Success meaning you finally figured out how to do it, or failure meaning that you have to abandon this current approach and choose another approach, and there's a whole lot of change and redesign. That's stuff that we're going to talk about a little later. So development is do a bit of everything, iterate towards a solution, discovery, and being very results driven in a dynamic process. Contrast that with regulatory. I would characterize regulatory as being very hierarchical. You start at the top and trace down. The phases are, help for clarity in terms of what are you doing to which piece. And it's a very sort of defined and maybe not static process, but at least it's not a fluid process. And next. All right, so defining the gap. So this diagram is basically a grid broken up between development and regulatory, and looking at this through the lens of a good cop, bad cop scenario. I thought it was sort of appropriate because, on both sides of the regulatory development fence, you have good players and, troublesome players. So, and not to take anything away from any of the players, there's valid reasons that they are doing what they're doing. So starting in the top left corner, the developer, who I'm calling good cop, I would say their typical view might be represented as, they're happy to do whatever they have to do, but they have a give me unambiguous direction criteria, which is like completely fair. So they're happy to comply with whatever the process is, just so long as the process isn't undefined and subject to interpretation and contradictions. By contrast, the development bad cop is the I hate writing documents, documentation isn't the code, and it works, so isn't my job done? And I think these extreme opinions sort of characterize this debate around the gap between the two sides. On the regulatory side, the good cop is somebody who is going to tailor the regulatory process and really navigate to the two principles of safe and effective. The bad cop on the regulatory side might be the letter of the law. I like this phrase of the law is ambiguous and it's rigidly enforced. Unless you write your process so it's extremely explicit, that if it involves more than, say, one document, then there's the potential for interpretation and misreading. So, and next. So this is the gap. This is the gap we are have come to discuss here. And of course, the gap between the good cop on both the development and regulatory side is relatively small and almost completely compatible. Whereas the gap on between the bad cop side of the fence is of course the thing that has to be managed. And next. All right. So further defining the problem. So those were gaps that had to do with like personality, workflow, and native tendencies. But there are also like logistical gaps. There are things that happen that cause division between the two groups. And these sort of break down into at least three categories for the examples that I laid out here. So requirements, you can have problems around the waiting for detailed product requirements decisions to be made. So product requirements always have sort of a progression. There's what you approve first in order to get engineering going. But then as engineering teases apart the implementation, they come up with questions, and some of those questions lead to new product requirements. Waiting for decisions to be made sort of causes a period of stall, a period of impatience between the two parties. Similarly, conflicting input. If conflicting input typically comes from the fact that often in projects that I've seen, there's no single source of truth that's used by the entire group. So we're going to get into this a little bit more further down, but if a developer doesn't have clear input on how to proceed, it's going to make the gap bigger. Finally, no timeline for answers. This is a big one. I think that this is big and important because this isn't visible. If you are developing code, if you have questions, if you don't know when those questions are going to get answered, then it stalls progress, and that just sort of again makes the gap larger between the two groups. They feel that they're being held back on the development side, and regulatory might see this just as a natural occurring process. In any case, it's not them who's holding up the progress. It's typically the product owner. And then lack of certainty about what level to document requirements. Writing requirements and writing specifications is an art. Not just anybody can do it, and there's plenty of mistakes to be made if the person you assign doesn't have a lot of experience. What I typically say, if there's one rule of thumb in terms of like what to document as requirements, it's what's essential for your intended use for your medical device. The next category of logistical gaps, basically stuff in the lack of deep understanding of corner cases. I've seen error recovery always be a problem in this regard. It's almost always misunderstood, underscoped. And secondly, deferring discovery. So if you don't do your prototyping up front and you push it to the middle of the schedule, you're just asking for a big ripple of changes that can go through your schedule, your requirements, your deliverables. And no single source of truth. I actually have a slide dedicated to this, so I won't go into this right now, but it's basically not knowing what's approved versus what's work in progress, what's under discussion. We said it in that meeting, but was that the actual decision, that sort of thing. And next slide. All right, so we've defined the problem. Now, these are some complicating factors that sort of pile on to the problem and make these native tendencies between the two groups even worse. So the first is a lagging process. So process lag. I tend to want to say in a conservative way that often, but I feel like usually and always is closer to the truth, that engineering is working on something before the QMS is approved. So you're starting some form of development without a QMS in place, and even if that development is too soon, too early, it's prototyping. What it does is it creates an ambiguity around, okay, should I be writing any of this down? Does any of this need to go in a document? Are we just going to sort this all out further on downstream? Don't worry about it now. So what that creates for the developers out there, I know there's always the term technical debt. It's sort of process debt, and it becomes probably the worst part about it is it just becomes confusion. It makes you feel like you're not really following a process, and you're kind of not sure when the process should start. And next. So an example would be, so when should design documentation begin? There are two rules of thumb I use for this. The first is when you're developing product as opposed to developing prototype. And what that means is if anything that you're creating is going to go into the final product, then you've actually begun development. If you're not going to throw away everything that you're doing right now, then you are doing product code. Prototyping is where you are creating something, but it's going to go in the garbage and you're going to start again from a clean slate when you're actually doing development. The second rule of thumb is it's really hard to say that you're doing design controls and design documentation should begin if the product requirements aren't approved. It just sort of raises the question, what are you developing to then if you don't have requirements? So often an early draft of the product requirements is it's best to approve that and have something official in front of the developers, which then they can create document against, and that way you don't end up with the cart before the horse. However, there are a couple of questions you can sort of, rhetoricals you can throw at this. So is there a precise point when you stop prototyping? So something of your prototype is going to make it into your development. So when is that precise point? And it's a fair point. The other rhetorical question here is, or notion is that product requirements are often evolved. And that's supposed to be a part of the process. So you should be writing your process so that product requirements can both be expanded upon in greater detail and also changed and corrected. All right, so complicating factors, ambiguous process. So this is a second complicating factor. The FDA contains, the FDA contains no specifics in their regulations, and it's a really fair question to ask. Why is that? Why don't they just tell us what to do? And next. Well, the FDA wrote regulations to promote flexibility for manufacturers. I feel like that line alone, a lot of people would, feel isn't true, but they did write regulations so that the manufacturers could decide the process that they want to follow. And next. So with a picture on the left, this is a picture that if you look in the center, the implementation of the medical device software shows the various standards and what impact they're supposed to have on the implementation. And yeah, frankly, when I see a diagram like this, it makes me sort of sigh heavily. And feel like it's going to take some concentration to sort of dig in to figure out what I should actually do. Just taking a look at each of these areas in yellow. So, these standards are just even in different categories. So what's the difference between management standards versus process standards versus product standards? I understand the difference, and yet the complexity of how they should play together and how I should assign each one importance or what role it plays in my process can be daunting. But it's a manufacturer's obligation to basically understand their own product, their environment, their application, and its risks. So having that autonomy as a manufacturer, creating a medical device means that you're doing the process tailoring, but there's going to be some ambiguity that you have to deal with there. And next. All right, so complexity and late discovery as another complicating factor. Put simply, there's a staggering amount of complexity with software in medical devices today. And, just to pick on some of the areas from the left, everything from the bottom, operating system and drivers, where it generally starts, interfacing to sensors and actuators, which these days can actually have their own processors on them, their own software. Your middleware, database, and safety system, and that sort of thing. Cybersecurity is a new element on the FDA's radar. And then there's knowledge of third-party libraries, machine learning, the user interface. Once you go into over Ethernet, then you're talking about cloud services, remote servers, downstream data consumers. So the list sort of goes on right on up to like mobile platforms, remote monitoring, and Internet of Things. So we keep inventing new software technology, and then we keep stacking it. So what's this going to do to this rift between regulatory and development? So it's so much content, and what it's going to do is it's going to create a lot of discovery around this service doesn't work as we thought it did. This technology needs to be replaced. There is a dependency between these requirements and that choice of solution. So, and could you hit next? So late discovery of technical issues can affect even non-adjacent layers. So this is sort of hugely disruptive. If, for example, you have a cybersecurity solution, a trusted protected memory that doesn't work, then adding it and then having it play with all the other actors on the screen is a huge daunting task. And it's going to make the confusion between regulatory and development, it's just going to enhance it. It's what are we supposed to do when all these things are changing at once in a time efficient and in a reasonable way. Next. So as I said, the trend here is that this is just going to increase going into the future. There's going to be the number of layers of things that we have in the software stack or in the technology stack, because this does include other disciplines of electrical and mechanical. But it's the number of layers and then the depth of complexity of those layers. Things like machine learning, it's a very, you can have multiple careers just in that box. But you multiply number of layers by depth of complexity, and you're going to have sort of a geometric complication. So I guess my point here is that this is the way it is now. It's going to get worse, and so our processes need to account for this. All right, so next complicating factor is managing change. So the change process is non-trivial. So even before you've hit verification and validation and things are less formal, the process is very messy. It's very variable. It depends upon how many things that thing was connected to. And basically the modification, approval, and tracing of design outputs is going to drive you crazy. Next. Once you hit V&V, then suddenly all your changes, have much more overhead to them. And there's sort of an overlap of change here, or overlap of areas. It's not just the technical change you're dealing with, which is mostly what you're concerned with on the left-hand side, pre-V&V. It's also the change control, and it's also risk management, that you have to make your change happen in accordance with all three of these. And next. So the takeaway here is that these changes are going to ripple through your design collateral. And next. And so this is an actual real-world example that I did to sort of communicate a error that was detected, a use error that was detected in summative testing. And the items in that are the sort of the mustard colored there, those are elements that needed to change because of this one late stage change that was made to the product. In summative testing, something had to change on the user interface screen, and it was important. So that change had to be captured as a product requirement, all the way on the left, and then that rippled down to the software requirement specification that modified the UI definition and the UI navigation documents. It affected the use FMEA. It changed some design documents, and of course there are source code changes. And then it had to be re-verified, revalidated, and it went into the V&V pool, and finally back out to summative testing. And to tie all this together, the tracing had to be updated. So this is, a demonstration of, this is a bit of a worst case. And frankly, it took about 3 months to put all this design collateral through the update, through the approval, and to sequence the change all the way out, reschedule summative, reschedule verification, validation, and regression testing. And this is going to be our reality. So when you're the takeaway here is that when you're developing a process, consider this diagram, consider this type of change, and account for it in your processes and what you choose to collect. Next. Oh, I'm sorry. Did we jump ahead too? Maybe there's no. Maybe we didn't. Okay, you're right. All right. So the next one is this is me taking pity on the poor software engineer, their cognitive saturation. The items in blue at the bottom have to do with regulatory process, portions of which they have to be familiar with. The items in orange are, you can sort of think you might have, 2 people trying to cover all the items in orange, or you might have a team of 30. I don't know which one is worse, frankly. But for cognitive saturation, of course, the fewer, the worse it is. But you have a software engineer who has all these layers of technology that they are trying to navigate, really, and do the right thing with. But all that is from the technical side. They're trying to achieve an outcome at the clinical application level. So that's also a significant portion of their attention. And in conjunction with this, they have at a minimum 1345 and 14971 that they're trying to comply with, but also all the design outputs going to the DHF software specifications, worrying about signature authority. There's a lot here, and we're sort of saturating people, and it's only going to, again, the message that this is only going to get worse. So that's the complicating factors, which up to this point, defining the problem and outlining complicating factors, I mean, it really looks like a train wreck. It really looks like, whatever the scenario has been in the past, it's going to be worse in the future. So now this next section is about solutions, thankfully, a little bit of upbeat here in terms of what we can do to help manage this. All right, so bridging the gap, process lag and ambiguous processes. So with respect to that, the simple answer is, at least in the beginning, don't create a gap. Don't set engineering about doing their thing without some guidance as to what they're supposed to be doing. Even if what they're supposed to be doing is next to nothing, it's good to have that down officially. And then that creates a lockstep between the two groups that hopefully you can continue. But at a minimum, it's like define, which is document, approve, and distribute design expectations when development starts. You could have an interim development plan just to avoid a gap here. So even if your SOPs aren't in place, if you have some sort of interim development plan, it joins the groups together. If you're doing prototyping and that's all you're doing, you could have, okay, well, here's the expectations of a prototyping process. If there are no requirements for prototyping process, then define the boundary to prototyping. Some statement of when it's over and when they've stepped over the line, and then what they should do once they step over the line. Size the plan to the risk of the development activity. So in other words, if they're doing prototyping, the risk is low and the plan can be pretty, extremely simple. But then grow the plan when you add new activities. And also make the process explicit and simple. The ultimate, what I want to say, guided approach here is to create work instructions. Now that ends up being other documents that then is sort of more cognitive burden for your engineers to process, but we'll get to some of the things you can do about that further down. Implement a QMS progressively. So use a risk-based approach to prioritize QMS procedures. This is becoming more in vogue now. If you need sort of like, okay, what's the minimum I need to start? I would say start looking at the something for a quality manual, design controls, document and records, and risk management is the place to start. And then add other SOPs or other procedures as they become relevant. Got to put a plug in there for KISS. Keep it simple / stupid. It's important when you say this to make sure you're not calling the person you're speaking to stupid. It's simple, stupid, which refers to the thing that you're designing. And then use tools early. So here, a common approach that we see with customers at ICS is, they start out on something like Excel or in a Word document doing requirements and tracing, and their plan is to migrate that later to some sort of tool. They don't know yet. They don't have time to look at it now. But if you use your tools early, you can avoid a lot of the conversion and conversion function, not just work of getting from one tool to another, but of confusing your people, and basically ingraining different mentalities and having different eras in your development path. And next. So bridging the gap for complexity and late discovery. So basically that means you're writing your procedures and plans to assume an environment of change. Late discovery is always going to happen. Complexity is only going to get worse. So don't treat change as the exception. Build technology changes into your process. Have a way of making decisions about technology, record it and move on. Have like an issue log or something to that effect that says we've made these decisions about our development. And frankly, things like an issue log like that gets used continuously ends up being a great help, because so many times I've been on the engineering side and did that conversation in that last meeting actually result in a decision? Until it's someplace official, you're always unsure. Write plans to minimize the impact of the change. and aggregate design. For example, if you were to aggregate design reviews for a subcomponent rather than to do it for each discipline within a subcomponent, that's one way of minimizing impact and dealing with things coherently. And lastly, so late discovery a lot of times happens because there's an interaction between software and electronics or mechanical that was unintended. So tightening up the cross-functional development is one way to pull that together. Changes to hardware can impact software and vice versa. Incompatibilities drive late-stage uncertainty, and design reviews should have exhaustive input from adjacent groups who have any impact whatsoever. And next. So next, bridging the gap for managing change. Well, the obvious that everyone says is, doing your investigations up front, and it's better to discover things in the beginning than late stage. I think everybody that's just part of the culture at this point. But more specifically, so manage change by minimizing change. So that means going after risky or complex components first, and that means you can identify these. And sometimes I see us using new technology, look at the sales material and say, it looks pretty good. Looks like it does everything we need. But unless you prototype with it, unless you put it to the test, then you don't really know how it's going to perform. I say here, if you haven't tested it, assume the packaging doesn't match the contents, because it rarely does. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about large companies or small companies. Until it works for you, it doesn't work. And then detailed review. The best place for late stage disaster to hide is in the cursory buy-in that you get when you put a new technology on the table and people are too busy to take a look at it. All right, so then cognitive saturation. So this is just basically about one person trying to do too many things, pulled in too many directions. So, the obvious is make the fewest demands feasible, really. And one approach that I often do or advocate for is, and even hire for, is to have regulatory people who aren't just there to sort of establish the process, but they're there to sort of drive the development formalization, to take the load off of engineering, to explicitly do the paperwork, to stay close to the details, to share as much of that blue section in the upper right-hand corner there, that blue section, as they can, to take it over and to drive it, and to not rely upon a software development plan or other plan that you put in front of engineering so that they can follow it. A lot of times what I see is here's the SDP, read it and hit me with any questions. And that ends up leaving a lot of that blue on the plate of the developer. And then simplest possible process. So I think in terms of like, what's the bare minimum? And then I tailor them to this specific product and what its risks are. More and more, the FDA is moving in the direction of risk-based approaches for all things, and tailoring your process with that in mind is entirely valid. I also have a bullet here, which is a bit controversial, which is avoid concessions to, well, yeah, that step has no value, but it's going to satisfy the auditor. It's a compliance. It's back to the compliance argument. And I guess, even as somebody who is now, but not originally, pro-regulatory, I make the argument that it's better to have a finding with an auditor, one that you at least protect yourself against as best you can. But if it has no value to the safety and efficacy, that's your argument. I think that different auditors have different pet peeves, and things they will recommend you do. But if you have a lot of audits and you add all those, things that you may not see the value in, to your process, now you're burdening your process. So rather than burden your process and take developers' minds off of the important stuff so that they can go deal with the stuff that's just going to irritate them, I would take the hit on the audit, frankly. And I would try to stand the ground there and argue that it doesn't have value for us. And lastly, consider work instructions for the most complex or common tasks. And work instructions is largely a way of not having regulatory repeat itself to developers, a way for them to sort of be independent of regulatory. So this point is a little bit contra my first, which is have regulatory drive development formalization. So I treat this as, I put it at the bottom of the slide, this is sort of a last resort. If you have a complex process that maybe you don't use, but once in a blue moon, fine, create a work instruction for it. But work instructions, again, add to, they work against a lot of the principles here, like cognitive load. And next. All right, so we made it through defining the problem, complicating factors, bridging the gap with solutions. There are a couple of topics that I'm going to call nuances. They deserve a bit of discussion to sort of be aware of them. They can be problematic. So I mentioned I was going to talk about this a little. So single source of truth. So the challenge here is both working on and accessing approved project documentation. So just to flesh that in a little bit more. So if you have a architecture document, if you have a PRD, software requirement specification, system specification, these are all documents, and you'll have an approved version of the document. You're supposed to be working against that approved version of the document. The confusion comes in when you have a work in progress version of the document that has the next batch of changes in. It's not practical to take every change, implement it immediately in the documentation and redistribute. So things get batched, but then that leads to people referencing the work in progress document as well as the release document. So then the question comes, okay, so what's your tool? If you are a paper-based company, meaning that all your documents are wet ink signatures and printed and kept in a physical DHF, so this argument doesn't really try to deal with that. This argument, because that's almost a whole topic that I could go on for about 20 minutes on itself, but I'm going to deal with the cases of, I think what we see common today is people trying to use file shares, and then there's people who have sort of a formal document control system. And so there are some characteristics here worth teasing apart. File shares, so things like Google Drive, so no Part 11 compliance really, no workflow management, there's weak versioning of documents, and there's weak version control, so ensuring that only the latest and greatest is what people are accessing. And there's weak audit support. So being able to see the history of a document and having that history be, non-volatile, so that somebody can't go in and alter it. And finally, no tracing. So often we see people start out with a file share and then switch to some sort of QMS, either QMS system or document control system. Some challenges with document control systems. They're a bit more like a database than they are a folder structure. You tend to not be able to navigate them by category. So you have to work with tags and look things up that way. So the biggest problem with that is just that it's a paradigm shift for people who are used to file shares. And that includes most of your engineering. They're used to working with something that's hierarchical that they can navigate. Access to approved documents is sort of license limited. So for document control systems, they're typically license based, and frankly, the our customers are reluctant to buy them for, their entire group. So they end up trying to get by with some sort of subset of the group. And right there, that means that, your entire group doesn't have access to the latest and greatest, which is what they're supposed to be using in their development. And a lot of the document control systems don't really have a built-in facility for that thing I was referencing before, work in progress. So if you have a document that's, it has a handful of revisions, typically that is managed outside of the document control system. When it's done, it's brought in and then routed, put through the workflow for approvals, and then treated as official. And then lastly, sort of an encumbered interface. You can envision sort of like something that's sort of database-like. The net result is that it results in sort of lagging updates. There's the conversation that just happened yesterday in a weekly meeting and decisions in there, and the time between that decision in that meeting and when the document reflects that tends to lag. And it's because of the basically all the bullet points above that. And then it also leads to this interesting behavior, developers, and I've done this myself, which is that because updates can be difficult to get, you end up saving copies to your hard drive, which is kind of the worst thing that you want to do, because then with the next release, the likelihood that all those places documents have been saved, them getting updated is less than zero if it can be. But in any case, you end up with using your document control system not as the centralized source of truth. So of course, this leads to uncertainty, mistakes, reworks, poor traceability. So solutions, design a document process that's sort of optimized for broad and easy access to approved documents. So something I end up doing is, or I have done in the past with some of the document control systems where accessibility was a problem, was I end up, once a document is approved, it gets published to a location that everybody in the group just has read access to. What that requires is then, somebody who has that job of continuously updating stuff from the document control system to that repository. But developers want something that there's a link to, one place they can click, get a document or set of documents or browse documents, which, is going to be necessarily file structure like. Yeah, you'll also absolutely need an easy review and approval mechanism. And, this is in the space of Part 11 compliance, some way so that you have a secure, auditable signature on the documents that have been approved. So, and to be able to show that the appropriate people approve the document. And as I mentioned before, you really need to account for the fact that some of these documents are in progress. So you need some mechanism for that. And also, as I mentioned, audit trail is important. So, main solution here is use customized tools for this process. Customized QMS tools, at least, are going to have everything in the context and workflows that are expected with medical devices. Next slide. All right, so the next nuance is this, when do we turn on design controls? When does development start? So first, just sort of not everybody is maybe on the same page here. So why do we need design controls? The top and foremost thing, I guess, in my mind is that it's important for it's important from the FDA's perspective to meet the needs of the end user and patients. Design controls is intended to ensure that the intended use is achieved, the intended use of the medical device. We need to prevent unintended behavior in the delivered product. So that means that while you're prototyping and you had a logging function or a backdoor, you definitely don't want that in the final product. design controls sort of ensures that you did a proper look at risks, that was formalized, traced, and verified. So what do you need to sort of start design controls? And really, you don't need a lot. I would say at a minimum, so if you're at that sort of prototyping place, it's like a development plan, which might cover which groups are doing what are the activities, the expected definition design, and V&V. That would all be like later stage. You know, if you haven't gotten to, if you're still in prototyping and haven't done definition design, V&V. But these are all pieces that you would sort of add iteratively. And lastly, of course, there are design outputs. So what are the design outputs that you expect from whatever stage you're in? You also need at least the design inputs. You can't really say that you're doing design controls until your product requirements have been approved. So even if they are preliminary, even if they are high level, you need something approved. Then also people would say, well, wait a minute, you need a QMS in place. You need SOPs, and you do, but depending upon how early you are, you might be able to, for example, if you're in prototyping, just have your development plan, make it unambiguous what's happening from the development and regulatory side to sort of begin that relationship, and then migrate it and expand it as you get further into your development process. So when should we start design controls? So whenever you're actually writing something that's going to be used in the final product. And so, you know, are we still prototyping? You know, is there any part of the prototype that's going to be used in a final product? You know, yes, then you are developing. And if, you know, no, if it's all throwaway, then yeah, you're solidly prototyping. Risks without design controls are that, you know, you develop the wrong functionality. And frankly, this is something that gets out of hand really quickly. It's really easy to end up with an implementation that didn't match the customer's needs. There's a couple of famous swing and tree examples that I probably should have used as a slide in here. Leaving unintended features in the product I mentioned. And also a big one is that when you're doing prototype code, nobody's reviewing that code. Nobody's looking at it. Nobody's making it product worthy. So if you take your prototype and just sort of roll right into development with it, you're basically taking something that hasn't had the scrutiny that you intended. So big miss there. Next slide. All right, so an acceleration opportunity. You don't get very many chances to accelerate. Frankly, prototyping doesn't get used enough, in my opinion. It's really an effective tool to take out late stage risk, which tends to have drastic consequences on your overall timeline of execution, budget, etc. So for example, one could use rapid prototyping user interface tools to basically design the interface, circulate, collaborate, explore corner cases, which is, you almost can't do enough of that. The sunny day path is always talked about exhaustively, and people never get to the rainy day paths, which if you're not familiar with the term, the error conditions, what happens if something, you know, wasn't where it was supposed to be at the right time? How does the system behave? How do we want it to behave? Getting those requirements done. And getting those done at prototyping time and having ideas well formed and agreed upon and socialized across your organization is a huge save to your downstream implementation. You can also version this stuff so that you have different instances and you know which one you're going to be moving ahead with. And rapid prototyping tools have the facility to basically export your prototype to target hardware. So meaning the CPU and display that you actually intend to use. And the full disclosure is that this slide off to the right is from an ICS, my company's. It's a bit of internal IP that we use, and it basically lets designers develop in the tools that they want to use, like Figma and Acture, and then once the clickable walkthrough on that has been rigorously gone over, revised, then porting that to code on the back end. I don't want to say it's just a button click, but it's vastly shortened. And really the most important thing about this is that the fidelity is maintained. So you're not at that point going from Figma and then sitting down in software development tools and trying to lay things out exactly. You have sort of an automatic machine generated set of code from those screens. So high fidelity prototyping tools get you pixel perfect exports and really maintain the fidelity from the wireframes to like the backend function calls. And next. All right, so we defined the problem. We talked about complicating factors. We talked about solutions, and then we went into a few nuances in a few areas. So in a nutshell, the summary is, and so we looked at how different native tendencies between regulatory and development impacted things. We looked at incompatible workflows between the two groups and how that further set them apart. And we also took a crack at sort of the best and worst that you can expect from each side. And it's really just speaking to a diverse set of personalities. So that added with a huge range of complicating factors means that this gap it's functional, it's cultural, and if you're attending this webinar, it's probably because you know that it's notorious. So what do we do about it? So don't start with a gap. Have something that ties the two groups together in the beginning. Create a microprocess to cement expectations. And the benefits out of that are like early process patterning, reduced ambiguity. You don't then have to convert to a different process later on, and there's less design refactoring, because when you touch all those design artifacts and as part of the conversion, you rethink them, and it ends up being just unplanned work. Keep things as simple as possible, and this is going to require fighting for, because the processes that typically accompany medical device are anything but sort of simple and obvious. But figuring out where you can cut out the fat with respect to your particular application it's not even just a one-time thing. It's something that you should be doing continually, and you will get big gains out of that by keeping it simple. Don't just hand a document to development with the software development plan, say, follow this, call me if you have any questions. Instead, ask your regulatory people to lead the process steps. Do as much of the work as they can for development, and that will also ensure that they get it in a condition and state that they're happier with. Number 4, leverage prototypes. So I think prototypes are vastly underused, and I think that the things that they would uncover are responsible for like 80% of why projects run over. And there are a great set of prototyping tools out there, and ones that are platform independent, like Qt, that are great for uncovering the risk earlier on when you don't have the burden of then changing all your design outputs. And turn on design controls only when developing production code. So turning on design controls when you're just out there sort of spitballing, and I think there are different opinions on this. Mine is that the correct line is, as soon as that that code is going unmodified into the product, then that's where design reviews have to happen. That's where a lot of things, productization of that code is a substantial thing. And carefully optimize the document management process. So focus on easy access to documents, particularly the approved ones. You need a facility in there to facilitate review, streamline it, have evidence of it, and also the approval needs to be built in as some sort of mechanism that isn't so burdensome to use that you only do it once at the end. And lastly, worry about how you're managing the work in progress, the documents that have changes in them, accruing changes, but they haven't been approved yet. And lastly, use customized QMS tools early. Avoid starting out in one tool and then switching to another. You're just asking for complications, not just in your program, but also in the deliverables. It's just going to complicate your design outputs. All right, and that's it. Any questions?
Wonderful, Milton. Thank you so much. I know I've certainly learned a lot from your presentation as that product development engineer previously who was not a fan of regulations. It's nice to hear the other side of it. I know there are others online similar to myself. We do have a couple of questions here. So to get us started, our first question, what would you say to the developer that is extremely resistant to doing the paperwork?
Yeah, so I've probably been that developer, maybe even more than once in my life. I think that, a large part of it, I think a lot of people would say, okay, you got to realize, you are in the regulatory space and it has requirements and there's a certain level of compatibility there. But I think that, the reason they're resistant to the paperwork can be that that a lot of it can end up being, for compliance. It feels like to them, they're doing it to check boxes. It's not actually helping their process at all. So the ultimate goal, of course, is safety and efficacy. So so making that point to them, clarifying that the particular step that you're grappling with, here are the limits. Here's and maybe the biggest place this crops up is under SDD, software design, detailed design. So the question is, what do they put in there? And frankly, a lot of what's in the software detailed design, beyond the tracing, effectively showing where a requirement or specification is satisfied, is for the engineer's benefit. So there's a lot of jujitsu, conversational jujitsu that can be applied there to say, a large part of this is for you. We just want to be able to show where something was implemented.
Would you say it's kind of like getting their brain onto paper so that other people can follow it along in the future as well?
Yeah, and I think the people, and for reference, the people who I've seen struggle with this, I mean, they're often brilliant, implementers, very high functioning people, but putting what's in their head on paper ends up being, they're just not wired that way. So from the regulatory perspective, it's, put your brand on paper, that's to serve other engineers. From the regulatory perspective, it's we need to show that it's in the product and, more than just through demonstration tests.
Absolutely. That kind of goes along with another question that we received as well, asking what would you like to see as part of that design specifications? Sounds like our listener who've added in this question said their developers are adverse to providing it.
So if design specification, so if we mean that there's a product requirements document and there's, for example, software specifications underneath that, the PRD is the, what we need to implement, and the specifications are how we're going to implement it. So this is really sort of cementing. If they don't have these requirements, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to parcel up the work, because there are no rules, there are no constraints, there are no contracts that need to be maintained between developers. Specifications help with that, and they help so that when you decompose your product into different components and you put them back together again, they actually work. So I think that's why a lot of focus, for specifications is put on interfaces, APIs, and how things work together, even at the like mechanical or electrical level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Perfect. Well, we still
Sure.
have lots of questions here, so I'm going to keep us going through some of these. Our next question that came in is asking, isn't the letter of the law more practical to comply with when auditors are involved?
Yeah, that's actually, I get that a lot. I think my response to that, and I think my response is controversial, which is that it's a value decision, and it's, do you value passing that audit more than you value, or the perception of how you did in that audit? Do you value that more than you do encumbering your development process and your product execution with lots of, let's call it like leftovers from previous auditors who said, you should show this and you should show that. And so if you're doing all these steps for these auditors who may not even be, future auditors, I think that you're making a choice that the audit outcome is more important to you than everything else in your product execution. So I tend to stand on the side more of product execution in that regard.
I think that goes
and
along.
Tell the regular.
Sorry,
go ahead. Oh, and I was just going to tag it on with and tell the regulator it's okay to have issues on those fronts, where they're making a stand.
Absolutely. And I was going to note here as well, we had somebody write in saying we need to do a better job explaining that we are not doing this to pass an audit or because the FDA makes us, but rather how it's going to help us to build and maintain better products. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I guess I'm limited, or I took the question in the context of the things that are don't always make sense given the context, but you're doing it because you're going to get dinged, in an audit with somebody who has that particular element that they care about.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Perfect. Well, our next question that came along here is, the stack of documents I have to wade through to comply with standards and regulations is mind-numbing. What does regulatory compliance have to be this complex?
Yeah, I do remember, like, as I started in my career making the transition to the regulatory side, ending up with like standard after standard open, and it felt like each of them was pointing to each other. And if you didn't have a stack of like 6 standards open, for example, like the definitions for the QMS 1345 are in 9001. So the notion that you need like 2 standards in order to just understand one body of work is, kind of strange. That said, I think it's the responsibility of the group in any given company to sort that out and provide a plan. So under your SOPs for everything, you have a plan, and basically do the simplification there. If they carry all that complexity down to the plan, to me, that's a scenario that could better optimize.
I think we lost your audio a little bit up there at the end. Would you mind repeating just your last statement? Possibly a little bit more fun with some audio issues here. Milton, are you still able to hear us?
Oh, and are you there?
There we go. Now we have you back. See, you just got to keep rolling with the fun punches of technical issues. Give us just 1 second here, please. Let's see if we can get our audio back up and running.
If you can hear me, it seems like we have another technical difficulty here. Good, that's the 3rd one. That means there can't be any more, but we are pretty close to the end as well.
Wonderful. Are you able to hear me now, Milton?
Now I hear you. Okay,
there
very good.
Go. Yes, I would say hopefully 3rd time would be the charm and we'll be good. Okay, so we still have a few more questions here if we can keep our audio working for us. So our next question that came through was asking, how will the FDA's move to 13485 impact the division between engineers and regulatory groups? Will it help it? Will it hurt it? Any thoughts?
I'm glad we got a third one in, frankly. Otherwise, I'd be walking around all day nervous. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, so our question was, how will the FDA move? How will the FDA
I'm sorry.
move? Oh, sounds like we might have a bit of a delay. Let me see if I can type this over.
Yeah. Okay, how will the FDA's move to 1345 impact, impact this division between engineers and regulatory groups? Yeah, that's a good question. That shift is more seismic than I thought it was going to be. And frankly, I think it's just going to sort of exacerbate the challenges. So for example, people on the development side who got used to sort of the whole design history file and DMR, those distinctions are going away. Basically, all the, I guess I'd call it a technical file, which is the EU MDR equivalent. So the DHF, the DMR, and I think the there's one other one in there. They're all getting merged, and so the distinction between those won't exist anymore. Yeah, under European implementations, having a technical file is the equivalent of those three. So I think that the change will, yeah, just exacerbate the confusion between the two groups. So it would be, yeah, I don't think there's any way around it. There's going to be some training that has to happen for people using the old standard of 1345.
Perfect. One last question here that I'm going to type over to you as well to hopefully avoid a delay.
Sure.
So hopefully while that is being sent over for everyone on our webinar here, the question is asking, what do you say to a company structures that struggles with the line between prototype and development? So in other words, engineering often help prototype become your product, and the rules are documented at the end, leaving things a little bit fuzzy. This is one of a couple questions we had come in, kind of looking to see where is that line between prototyping and then the actual development, which is going to lead to that end product. Would you be able to expand a little bit more on that for us, Milton?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you what my favorite approach is, and it's I think it's a great area that well, I have a favorite approach for sort of a monolithic way of dealing with it. Then there's a follow-up, harder question of how do you do it if this is progressive. But the monolithic answer is just, you can think of it as the instant that your PRD is approved, anything that is intended to be product code should go through a one-time process of code review, of documented code review, design review, etc., in order to bring it into the fold. So if you did a lot of prototyping, that you can cover a lot of stuff at once and sort of do it in a couple of days, minus any productization edits you might need to do. But the benefit of doing it all at once when your PRD is approved is that you get all the ducks aligned at that point in time, and you can point to an exact day when from that point on you're following a different process. Where it gets messy is if you have 4 engineering areas and 3 of them are done, and 1 is going to be prototyping for the next 4 months. Then you end up doing this process on a per component basis. So, which is also fine. It's a clean story that you can tell to the FDA, but it just requires more management in segregating the elements that are going under design controls immediately versus the ones that are not.